Tonight's conversation brings together two prominent and intellectually distinct voices within contemporary European conservatism. Martin Sellner, an Austrian activist and one of the most influential advocates of the concept of remigration, and David Engels, historian, author, and former professor of Roman history, whose work has focused extensively on European identity, civilizational decline, and the historical parallels between the crises of the ancient world and those confronting Europe today. The purpose of this discussion is not merely to debate whether Europe should have more or less immigration, nor it is intended to remain at the level of electoral politics, border policy, or even demographic statistics. Instead, we want to examine the deeper philosophical, historical, and political questions that emerge once we start speaking about remigration and the preservation of European civilization. At the center of the debate lies a simple question: what exactly are we trying to preserve? Martin or David, welcome to this interview. Thank you both for being here and wanting to do this debate. Um, do you have anything to add, or shall we start with the questions?
No, thank you. Nothing on my side, but thanks a lot for the invitation. I think I'm already looking forward to discussion with the two of you.
Same, only thank you for the invitation. Looking forward for the debate.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll start with our first question about the more of the definitions. When Martin, when you speak about replacement migration, do you mean a deliberate political project, an unintended structural process, or a demographic outcome produced by multiple factors?
So replacement migration is a descriptive term describing a certain kind of migration which has the outcome of replacing the indigenous population of a certain area, making a minority in their own homeland. So obviously not every kind of migration is replacement migration, but the migration we have today in swaths of Europe, most part of Central and Western Europe particularly, is a demographic replacement migration. It's even called like that in the UN. And for me, this is a descriptive term. It is happening. Nobody can deny it. The great replacement or other terms where there's also an inclination of who's behind it is a different question. For me, this is not the main question because that is happening, cannot be refuted at all. And it's happening, which means we must stop it with remigration.
Okay, Mr. Engels, do you have something to add to this? Do you think it can be refuted or not that we are being replaced as indigenous people?
I mean, the term of when does really replacement start? So do we need the others to be 50% in order to start to be replaced, or are there already significantly lower numbers that can change already the constitution of a society? Is of course interesting, but also theoretical question. I mean, I still remember some years ago one of my first interviews with the Deutsche Welle. I think I used the term Massenmigration, and I was immediately scolded by them, talking that something like Massenmigration doesn't exist, that this is a right-wing term, that there is no mass migration at all. So that happened, I think, 12 years ago. So I found that extremely funny because it happened before 2015, and it showed, of course, how the dialogue and how the narrative has changed. Because I think that today nobody would not want to use that term. I think what I found the most interesting in your question was the second part. So is this this factor or this factor? Is it a combination of them all? And I think that, yeah, indeed, we have so many different tendencies that are playing together. Most of them you already named, of course, and I don't think that it is useful to point one single factor or even to develop some form of grand narrative that everything is somehow steered. I mean, it is obvious that there is a use in mass migration. We will speak about it. A use for a certain elite, for a certain project of social and cultural restructuration. But what I could bring to the fore, as not being a politician, ideologist, but a historian, is the fact that, and that's my main point, that mass migration is something that happens at the end of every civilization. And I think that is very interesting to see that in the late Roman Republic, in the Han Empire, in ancient Iran, even in late classical Muslim civilization, the fact that we have a mass migration from the outside that is somehow welcomed, somehow not, that has a political use, that has a cultural use, that is debated, but that sooner or later leads to multiculturalism and even forms of replacement, is not something very new. It is something that happened towards the end of every civilization. I think that gives this entire dimension perhaps a bit more deterministic, perhaps even more pessimistic ring, but I think it's an aspect we shouldn't forget also.
Do you agree, Martin, that it is actually not something new, that we have been faced with these crises before? General in the world?
I would say yes, there are similarities, but I would still say it's something on a very different quality in many aspects. First of all, in the quantity. So this kind of non-European massive immigration, if you want to go back, we can see the Yamnaya immigration to Europe thousands of years ago. And even here, we could debate whether these people were as foreign as the people who are coming to Europe right now. Apart from that, when we look back, it only was the invasion of the Huns. It was the invasion of the Moors in Spain. So what's happening right now is not a minor effect. It's even more drastic than the Völkerwanderung, so at the end of the Roman Empire, because these were still Indo-European people who come from one stem in a way, who were replacing each other, moving around on their continent. So in ethnocultural terms, it's very unique. And where I'm also more hopeful is, I don't think we are just witnessing cycle, cultural winter, decline, which is in any way, shape, or form similar. It's comparable, but it's not similar to the death of ancient civilizations. I don't think Europe is dying of old age. I think Europe is being murdered because every day millions of resources and people are moved to repress a healthy, instinctive reaction against that. And at the same time, we see comparable nations who have the same problems: nihilism, technology, capitalism, liberalism, but who don't follow this path of replacing their own population. So I would say that great replacement has one root, which is white guilt, which is self-hatred, which is the new religion of universalism, of guilt, of self-hatred, of anti-white, anti-Europe, anti-Christian ideology. And this is being used to suppress the natural immune reaction. And that's why the great replacement is a phenomenon unique to European, Christian, post-Christian, white countries. And that's why it can also be stopped, because this is a thing that could be overcome. So to put it in short terms, our friend Europe is not dying of old age. It's not dying of a sickness which is incurable. It's being poisoned every day, which means we can stop the poisoning. We can cure it. Obviously, there will be damages. After such a long process of poisoning, you might not be able to save everything, but I think you are able to save Europe as a whole. So I would say the similarities are there. We need to learn from them, but there's a huge distinction. I put into one last part. There was no anti-Roman Antifa at the end of Rome. At the end of Rome, there was no Antifa movement which would attack every Roman patriot. There were the aspect of decline, of being full of yourself and like some kind of self-loathing, but it was never this kind of self-hatred.
Okay, David, there are similarities, Martin says, with the Roman times, perhaps, but the difference for him, if I can put it more bluntly, is that the white guilt, the self-hating of the people in the West now, that's the big difference. Do you agree with that statement or not?
I mean, obviously, the situation in every civilization is very different, be it the early imperial Chinese civilization, be it the late Roman Republic. Could also speak about late classical Muslim world, where we have, for example, massive Turkish migration coming into the Muslim world and replacing more and more the Arab elites, and of course also the local pre-Arab elite. So of course every civilization has its difference, and Martin has certainly a point in the fact that the other civilizations have rarely reached a point of self-hate and self-loathing comparable to what the West is currently experiencing. This is even one of the points where even someone like Oswald Spengler has not been pessimistic enough, because then in his Decline of the West, of course, his vision that there would still be something like Western or national patriotism around, and some will to fight for some idea of civilizational survival, that seems much too optimistic in comparison to what we have today. But of course, on the other hand, the Western civilization has always been a civilization of Faustian lack of measure for best and worth. So it's not so astonishing that even when it comes to our self-destruction, we are going some steps further than the others. I would disagree though on the how we assess the current level of the European civilization, because I think we are this mass migration is just one aspect, of course, of a very defeatist, a very self-loathing, self-destructive, self-depreciative attitude we are in, and that is not new. I mean, look already at the late 19th century, all this decadence literature. Somehow it has been quite for a while that we feel that we are in a late time. And I mean, on the one hand, we have mass migration, but on the other hand, we have also so many Europeans who don't have any kids, for example. So, and that is, of course, a deliberate choice. Now, we could, of course, say that the minds of the Europeans are at the same time, of course, also poisoned by the media, by all this hedonistic materialist culture that is around. But that would lead us again to the question: intentionality or not? Is there some form of general historical civilizational cycle around, or is this a deliberate action? And I think that is probably a point where we would disagree. Perhaps just one remark, but I think we will speak about that also later. I'm not sure if we can use terms like anti-white and anti-Christian as synonyms. I think these are quite different aspects when it comes to understand what is the identity that is under attack or that we would like to defend. Is this about civilizational issues? Is it about ethnic issues? Is it about religious issues? Is it all at the same time? But of course, this is something where I guess we have to be very careful. Perhaps one last point, because we already used also the terms Indo-European and so on. Well, I think that probably, I mean, look at the UK. I think that our current problem would be quite the same if most of the migrants would not be from a Muslim, so in certain parts Semitic background, but let's say, for example, from a Hinduist Indian background, which would make them even linguistically and of course ethnically somehow Indo-European, without the main problem being different. I would even say that if we would not now have dozens of millions of Muslim migrants, but dozens of millions of Chinese migrants, the problem would also be very similar. So it's not just about one group, but I think it's the fact that our civilization as such is suddenly confronted to another civilization starting to live in its midst and trying to impose, of course, its own vision on tradition, on family, on religion, on rights, and so on. And that this is, of course, provoking a civilizational infight that could be mortal for our civilization.
Okay, thank you very much. We will go to a further question. Martin, how do you define remigration in strict legal terms? So, does it apply only to illegal migrants, to rejected asylum seekers, or also to legal residents, naturalized citizens, second generation migrants, or culturally unassimilated communities? How far will you start with the remigration if you had the chance?
I would define remigration by its outcome. Remigration wants to stop the great replacement and undo it as widely as possible. And I don't want to go too much into detail, obviously, and I'll need to show you my book. It's called Remigration, and I go a bit more into detail here. And to make it understandable more easily, but also to differentiate between the tools of remigration, which is an umbrella term for several instruments, political, cultural instruments, I separated in 3 groups. I think you've already called them out in your question. First of all, we have illegals. These are, in my opinion, or asylum seekers, everybody who illegally, irregularly immigrated to Europe. In Germany alone, at least 4 million. Now with the family reunion, also even more people. In my opinion, they all have to go. Of course, there was exceptions, but like the standard demand of remigration is people who came here irregularly, abusing the rules of asylum, obviously, because all of them crossed secure third countries, eventually have to go home, at least when there's peace in their homelands. A second category would be non-citizens, so people who don't have a citizenship. First of all, I would like to stop mass naturalization. So only with 100% assimilation and only with migrants we can also culturally take into our fold. Assimilation should be unthinkable. And those people are non-citizens. I don't think all of them are a threat to our ethno-cultural continuity. We mentioned before, Professor Engels mentioned that even Hinduistic replacement would be an issue. I agree. I have to say, I even would not like to be replaced by Swedish people. So if Austrians would be the only one who died out and only Swedish people came, it would be more pleasant, yes, but still, I don't want my culture to die. It would die with constant Swedish replacement migration. But for non-citizens, for migrants who don't have a citizenship, those who are cultural, economical, or a criminal burden, they also should leave at some point, so you just don't prolong their stay in their visa. And then there's a third group, which is a group that brought me in trouble: non-assimilated citizens. Obviously, there's been a big problem, and I would say this is the biggest crime of our generation and generation before, to mass assimilate and mass naturalize people who don't identify with this nation, with this body politic. This is creating the ethnic vote. It's basically destroying democracy from within. It's I would say, a testing ground for a civil war, which has been created right now in Europe. Here, obviously, I'm not for the deportation of a citizen, but I would say what we can create is a structural, cultural, economic pressure on parallel societies and voluntary incentives of people to return to their homeland. One example that we can bring up to make it concrete: in Germany, there was a terrorist attack on a gay parade committed by a young Arab guy, a Muslim from Afghanistan, I think, but he was born in Germany to asylum seekers who already have been basically naturalized, so he's a German citizen. But he didn't want to stay in Germany. He wanted to leave Germany. He actually wanted to join the jihad, but he was brought back by the German state from Lebanon. So in that case, I would create an incentive and ways for those people to leave if they don't fit into our culture. So altogether, very, very quick, easy summary. This is remigration, and all of it applied would immediately stop the great replacement, slow it down, and then turn tides. And obviously, the whole process, after my calculation, would take about 30 years. But if no new migrants come in, if problematic groups have a minus migration because those people leave, if you stop the process of mass naturalization, then obviously you're changing tides. Doesn't mean that multiculturalism will disappear from our societies within a few months. Obviously not. But in 30 years, Germany would be more German than today. Belgium would be more Belgian than today. And
not sure if that's the best example, but
let's say Walloon would be more Walloonish and Flanders would be more Flemish, to not offend anyone in Belgium. And this is the thing. So we need to change the tide, and then Europe can rise and live again. So I strongly believe it's possible if we can gather the political will.
Okay, it is possible with the political will to change the tides. Do you agree with that, Mr. Engels?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, with the necessary political will, is this will there? That's of course a huge question, because such a program is I mean, not even speaking about the justification or no of that program, but of course it's something. It's a generational program. It's something that would bind an entire civilization for at least a generation behind one program. So the question is, of course, is that something that even if you would like to achieve that can be achieved within the structures, political structures, democratic institutional structures as they are for the moment. So that would be, of course, one of the purely practical caveats I have for the moment, because I don't see how we could put forth something like that, even should we want it. The other, I mean, I'm the eternal pessimist, obviously. So the other question we can ask ourselves, would that even be enough? If the will would be somehow to recreate a European civilization that is as demulticulturalized as possible, would the fact to stop migration, to send back the illegals, to work a little bit on the fuzzy end, and to help people who are not integrated going perhaps back where they would feel better, would that make such a big difference? And of course, for countries like Germany, probably, because mass migration into Germany or Austria is quite recent. Now, arguing from a Belgian or French position, where we do not have so many post-2015 immigrants. We have a much older immigration, people who are there for 3 generations, sometimes 4 generations, many of whom are not perhaps integrated. So what to do with these people somehow, who clearly do not feel like Westerners, who would like to stay here because it's agreeable for them, but still who would like to impose their vision on civilization on us. So thinking about how we could deal with that question, I think for France or Belgium, other countries, that's the biggest chunk of people. Somehow we have to discuss about that. And frankly, I don't have an open or any answer to that, because you already mentioned the term, of course, civil war. This is something that is looming on the horizon, especially in countries such as France. And imagine how to do in order to avoid that for all of us is a huge question. So the thing I would insist on essentially is, of course, we want to defend our civilization, but what is that? What is this civilization? What could be the comparison point to which we can compare the people living here and saying, do they correspond to a certain image of Western civilization or not? And of course, there are extremely different approaches. The liberal view on Western identity or the Christian traditional view on Western identity are radically different. So this is even a huge choice and a huge division within the political right, whose vision of into what people should fit and how do we want people to feel towards their European identity can be radically different. So I see that, of course, as another problem. And then just to open a last problem that of course needs also to be put into the debate is the question about our political means. Sending back tens or hundreds of thousands or millions, as you said, of people from Germany to other countries, and other countries who do not want to get them back. How to do that from a concrete point of view? I mean, we would need enormous means of pressure, even military pressure, economic pressure. We would need a strong European cooperation. It would even need some form of, I dare say, neo-colonial engagement outside of Europe in order to be sure that people stay there who are illegal in Europe. So that would, of course, necessitate not only a totally new nation state, but also a totally new European Union. Because this is, of course, a place where we would start to destabilize many countries in the Middle East or in Africa, of course, and then we would start to meddle in with the interest of the Chinese and the US. So we would need, of course, to work at the same time, perhaps even prior to that, on a totally different form of European Union. So I think there are a lot of different aspects that would be touched, of course, by by such a program. And I had been quite optimistic, perhaps even 10 years or 12 years ago, when it comes to the wish of the European people to survive and to unite and to build their own autonomous bloc within this multipolar world. But during these last years, I've becoming more and more pessimist about this practical possibilities. And of course, we didn't even yet open the question about human rights, of course, about people who are living here for many generations, who have their identity. The difficulty, of course, after 3 or 4 generations to say, yeah, well, now we would like somehow to incentivize you to leave this country. I mean, this opens, of course, from a Christian point of view, a lot of moral issues that would also need to be talked about.
Okay, Martin, the first time probably in a long time, you there stated that maybe you don't even go far enough to save the European civilizational, but there were a lot of practical issues or moral issues that David has said. Now, what is your reply? Is it
Yes, I think it's important to look systematically at the issue. So is remigration logistically and financially possible? I would say 100% yes. Because it was possible that millions came here illegally, millions can go home legally, and it's theoretically absolutely possible. Is it mathematically is it morally possible? Yeah, and justified? I will say also yes, because the right to our own homeland weighs higher than the individual need of a person to improve his own life. Obviously, there are always edge cases, and what I would say, you should never kill people, torture people. You should treat them justly, obviously, but measures that ensure that we keep our ethnocultural continuity, which has a value in itself, obviously outweigh the interest of individual millions of Africans to live in Europe, because also in the end, this mass exodus isn't helping Africa at all. So it's also not even in the interest of them in the long term to leave the nation in swarms. The big question is it likely? So the political likelihood is something very complicated. I would agree, yes, at the moment it might not look likely because it's such an immense task. But since there's no alternative, tertium non datur, it's either remigration, a drastic reduction of the foreign populations, and a reharmonization of our societies towards relative homogeneity, obviously with a policy of isolation, remigration, closed borders, there are a lot of factors into that. Or it's civil war, it's a disruption, it's fragmentation of the state. And I think there will be so many ethnic shocks, formative events, like 9/11 was a formative event. How it happened, I don't want to go into that, but it was a formative event and changed the course of geopolitics in the United States. Fukushima was a formative event. Germany shut down its nuclear plants. And we see these ethnic shocks increasing in intensity. And Ceuta was an ethnic shock. The death of Irina Zarutska was an ethnic shock. And these ethnic shocks are increasing. Every time they're converting people, every time they're waking people up, and they will increase in intensity. And as always, with one pleasant lie after another, the change will come at the very end. Like, we all men, when do we go to the doctor? When we're already bleeding and cannot get up anymore because it hurts so much. And that's the same with Europe. So I think the political pressure will increase. And since there's no alternative, because the vivre ensemble did not work, the integration system did not work, multiculturalism failed, they have no answer for any of the questions. And the only tools are now repression, and bread and circuses are running out. And even the migrants themselves don't integrate into this ideology of guilt and of end of history, left-wing liberalism. I think the only alternative will be an attempt for remigration. It will come. The question is, how far will it lead? Will it work? If it fails, then this was the last attempt, but there will be a big pushback. I think Austria might be one of the first countries. We're going to see which country will join. And I think in the end, there will be a remigration alliance between certain political fractions. While on the other hand, you already have the Islamo-Marxist alliance forming up, from Jean-Luc Mélenchon to Mamdani to the Linke in Germany. So this is the new alliance of left-wing traders, delusional Marxists, and Islamic colonialists who are already teaming up. So in the end, I think, yes, there will be a push for remigration. I think it will work. All the issues that Mr. Engels has addressed can be solved and resolved, especially, and this is my final point responding to that, the migrants are here for economic reasons. They're not really here to conquer a nation, so that's why very often the terminology of conquering, invading is wrong. They're not like Alexander the Great who wanted to conquer something for the glory. It's an individual swarm movement. They're only here for money, and they even have a very big internal European mobilization. That's why you will have an early buyer advantage for remigration. When Austria starts remigration, we only need to do some nudging because they will all leave to Germany first. So this is going to happen. It's already happening within Germany. Like when the AfD will win Eastern Germany, there'll be an exodus of migrants. So they're only following the money. If you cut the money out here and you increase the money in a different place, naturally they will follow there. So just one concrete example, you have in Austria, Germany, in the Germanosphere, millions of migrants who are on welfare. If you cut this welfare, but at the same time, when they register at home, you pay out the welfare for a while at a national bank, but they have to stay at home, a lot of people will just choose this option. So it's always the question, like Sun Tzu said, if you put people in the corner, yes, they'll get aggressive if you do it at once. But if you do it in stages and you always create a golden bridge home, it will work. And last but not least, compared to ancient Rome and the fall of the classical Islamic world, we now have compared to that, relatively endless resources. So we have the money to bribe them. We have the money to give them incentives to go home. I wouldn't say endless, maybe that's an exaggeration, but the issue now really is a political one. It's only a question of political will. If you had the political will, if you would give identitarians the political power, it would be very easy to do that. And I think this is the big difference between other civilizations who went down because they didn't even have the resources anymore. They didn't have the army. They didn't have the military potential to defend themselves like ancient Rome. But we would have all the armies. We would have the drones. We would have the big data. We have the money. It would be not a logistical issue, at least in the next 15 to 20 years, to start a process of legal and thorough remigration.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sellner. We will proceed with another set of questions. We already started a little bit on the topic, what is there to save? What is a European identity? What kind of civilization do we want? Do we want a more liberal civilization, back to our Christian roots, etc.? Now, for you, Martin, what makes someone European in your view? Is it merely ancestry? Is it culture, language, loyalty, religion, citizenship, shared memory, combination of these? And how do you see if it is possible to become European for someone who actually, let's say, migrates from another country, but says, okay, I really, really enjoy Europe. I really look up to Europe. And can they become Europeans in your view?
European is an ethno-cultural term. So it's not just ethnic. A term like white obviously is an ethnic term, but being European does not just mean having a bright skin, being white. We see this with white people who moved to Australia, to America, who now have created different cultural identity and I also would say a different society. So European is an ethno-cultural term, but obviously it also has an ethnic dimension. So they are ethnic Europeans. They are the First Nations, the natives of Europe. And this is something that you cannot change. I know this is a scandalon to the modern world. Everything that your own willpower cannot change, that the own subject cannot sovereignly rule over, is be seen as something sinister. But just as you cannot change your sex and your gender and become transgender, which is wishful thinking, you cannot become trans-European or trans-Japanese. So if I moved to Japan, I could not become a Japanese. Although, obviously, I can culturally assimilate. So I can fully culturally assimilate into a certain culture. But assimilation is a process which goes both ways. So it only works when the culture is welcoming and accepts me as one of them, in spite of my different ethnic heritage. Will obviously not change. So I think the idea of like being aggressive and angry and calling us racist when you're not suddenly becoming colorblind or asking somebody where he comes from originally when he obviously doesn't European is crazy. But on the other hand, I also have to say, yes, assimilation can work. So it would be also ahistoric to say that it cannot work at all, because it has worked in European history and the history of the world. But the question is always the quantity, the speed, and the context. And for assimilation to work, you need to have people who fit, or if they don't fit, like a very small amount of people, and you have a very strong, very vital, energetic, native population. In German, we call it Leitkultur. I like this term. And if you don't have this, then it doesn't work at all. And today we see it since the German Leitkultur is now a Leitkultur, which means a culture of suffering and self-loathing. Obviously, nobody wants to assimilate into that. And what we have are just parallel societies. So I would say, in general, yes, it works. But at the moment, it doesn't, because we don't even have the capacity, plus way too many, way too much. And but I would say identitarian migration policy would have assimilation as the standard principle for any kind of naturalization, but it would keep the numbers low and would have a very high threshold. For example, look at Saudi Arabia, look at the United Arab Emirates. 70 to 80% of the people there are non-citizens, are foreigners. None of them is naturalized. You need to stay 20 years in the country, invest millions, convert to Islam. In Oman, you need to convert to Islam if you want to have the chance for a handwritten letter of getting citizenship. So obviously, what has been done by politics here, getting all these people, giving them the same rights as you and me, the same duties, while they don't feel any identity to our ethnocultural continuity, is crazy. I think it's the biggest political crime, and our grandchildren will still suffer for this political nonsense. So I would say you only can let those people in and naturalize those people who can be stomached by your country. And that's why I strongly criticize also the liberal and the libertarian discourse about migration. It's only an economic discourse about migration, but it needs to be cultural. So the question, biggest taboo question, but it needs to be asked: how many Syrians, for example, can enter a European nation without changing it? And the left doesn't even have an answer to that. On the right, you have people say like 5 per year. Then you have people say nobody, not one. Others say maybe 50. So on the right, you have a variety of standpoints towards that. But on the left, they say you're not even allowed to ask this question, which is crazy. So this was a very long answer, but I hope I got my point across.
I think you're
Thank
muted,
you
Sisha.
very much, Mr. Engels. So, can assimilation work? Can we present a European identity still? Is that still possible? And what is the difference between now and our ancient Roman times, when you still had, like, okay, you have the Roman virtues, you had something to integrate in.
Yeah, I mean, it became already a problem in the late Roman Republic, especially the big megapolis in the ancient world were, of course, the object of mass migration. We do not have to think about the end of the Roman Empire. Already the late Republic was a good example of big cities becoming overcrowded by people not even from a Greek or from a Roman background. I mean, there are even a series of law of remigration in the late Roman Republic, where outsiders or foreigners were expulsed from Rome, of course, which didn't really never work because there were not the logistic means to impose all that. And of course, also the late Roman Republic was in an identity crisis. So there was also a problem of how to integrate and into what, which was one of the great exploits, of course, of the Emperor Augustus, to having precisely created such a Roman Leitkultur, such a Romanitas, into which foreigners could integrate. And I think that is probably, as I try to show also in some of my recent books, how that can be an example. I mean, Augustus, even on his deathbed, warned the Romans from naturalizing too many foreigners, liberating too many slaves, and making them Romans, in order not to dilute the Roman identity and the feeling of loyalty towards the Roman Republic or the Roman Empire. So, which is why they put on, of course, a multi-level system of integration. If you went, for example, to the Roman army, if you learned Latin, if you venerated the emperor, if you sponsorized some stuff in your hometown, if you married a local girl and had kids, if you wore the toga, if you tried to show your acceptance of Roman culture, then bit by bit, step by step, you became integrated into the Roman Empire, and you could even become one day senator, or one of your descendants could even become emperor. So the late Roman Republic and the early empire is a quite good example of how this debate around light culture, how to integrate foreigners in a constructive, peaceful way through incentives and through, let's say, the generation of positive feelings towards the Roman culture did work and could work. So I think we can learn a lot from that. Now, that is also why my own main concern is not so much only with foreigners, but even with Europeans, because imagine, from a practical point of view, somehow we want to define, and we need to define, of course, what is a European, what is a Westerner, what is the archetype to which we all should approach somehow to correspond to this ideal. And that has been very clear for many centuries. We always had this positive ideal about the British gentleman, about the medieval knight, for example. So there have always been positive examples of identity around. Now, today it's extremely difficult. And I would say that probably we would have even more Europeans themselves who do not correspond and who do not want to correspond to such a positive, constructive example of an archetypal European than foreigners. And I think that is the biggest problem for the moment. It would not even only be with people who are here for 3 or 4 generations, who did not really assimilate, who integrate from an institutional point of view, but who basically live within their own parallel society. But most Europeans themselves have ceased to be patriots, to be loyal to their own civilization, to know their civilization. And I see that with my students every day, that this is a huge problem. So the work we have to do would be titanic, and would not only be directed towards this issue about migrants or 3rd or 4th generation migrants, but even towards the native Europeans. And that is the point where we see that the main issue is certainly not an ethnic issue, that even the term ethnocultural somehow pastes over a little bit what Spengler already announced as being the type of the Fellahin, that is, of the post-civilizational person belonging to a civilization but not really liking it, and just making it work, but without any feeling of affection to it. And I think that is a status that many Europeans have already reached. And so trying to work on a strong integrational power in this time is extremely difficult if we do not have, as Martin also insisted on, disruptive elements, huge changement of conscience, and of course huge political changes with the opportunity and the possibility to implement such things on a generational level. And I do not yet see that as a possibility. It might perhaps one day be in the US, as its constitution seems to be rapidly changing, but within the good old European Union, I do not yet see that arriving. But once again, I'm not a politician, so I'm rather asking questions and speaking about the framework than really trying to offer answers. So that is why I think that we complement each other quite well, because he has the ideas and I'm asking or wondering about the degree of feasibility.
Okay, so yeah, we already brought it up, Martin. Even Europeans ourselves really don't have a notion of a belonging to European civilization. So, can you understand maybe David's, Mr. Engels' his criticism that it is maybe just a sign that even the term ethnocultural is more or less a phase of of decline, and we don't really have this European identity like it was in the Middle Ages with Christianity, or with the Res Publica, with the Greek philosophy and sciences, etc. We have, of course, a lot of things out of in our ancestry, but when it is nowadays, we don't feel actually a connection anymore, even amongst white people ourselves.
Yes, I agree with that. In parts, like I would say, I agree in the part of the analysis. First, about Rome, I think it's very good that Engels also brought up the problems that migration brought up for Rome, because very often people like mention how multicultural the ancient world was, but a lot of historians stress the factor of massive immigration as one of the big important factors Roman decline. And even like the Romans were complaining about it. Juvenal wrote that the Orontes is flowing in the Tiber. Today, the Kabul river is flowing in the Danube. So these always have been a challenge and an issue. When it comes to this big question, I fully agree, but I would say that's not just a European question, it's a global question. We're seeing the death of transcendence, the death of every meta narrative, and we're living globally in an antinatalist, individualistic world where what Seefele calls the Dionysian individuum is ruling. It's the subject that doesn't want to have any border, any form, just is an hedonistic cell. And that's a process of disintegration happening everywhere, from South Korea to Japan. So I wouldn't say that's just a European factor. And at some point, we need to find a solution for that. Obviously, we need to overcome nihilism. I think the only answer will lay in religion, transcendence, and faith. But this is one battle. It's one spiritual battle, an intellectual battle. But the other thing is the mere survival of our identity and of us as a political subject. And the conditions of the possibility to solve this big riddle, this big question, is that we merely survive. And there are nations and there are countries like Japan, like South Korea, who are in very similar conditions, or even Israel, who has very similar problems, who find a way of ethnoculturally surviving, not breaking the continuity. And I agree that just grasping on this ethnocultural continuity, having remigration as the center idea, is absolutely a sign of decline, because you're not fighting for a higher cause anymore. You're not fighting for a new chapter in the history of idea, for a katechon. We don't have this big idea right now, which is uniting Europe. We don't have an empire in Europe at all. But I think that a pure tribal instinct of survival can create a new European unity, can create a new front, a new community, and maybe out of this struggle, maybe out of this fight, something new could arise. And that's something where I see a big hope, especially when I see the young identitarian patriotic activists who come from the national traditions, but feel very similar, where kind of a new European feeling is arising. And I think maybe this fight, maybe the struggle for remigration, we'll see in which, I think we'll win, definitely. We'll see in which extent. This could be the birthplace for a new European identity, which then also faces this big question. And here, my fight for remigration and for ethnocultural continuity is a transcendent fight. I think only if Europe survives, and only if the European Daseins, or the European way of being in the world, the European languages, which also don't exist like this in America, survive, we'll have a chance to overcome the ideologies of modernity, which are now materializing in transhumanism, in this techno-capitalistic Moloch. And I think it was created by Europeans. It was created by European thought, by our software. And I think if Europeans perish, if the islands where general European people live, think, and feel vanish, I think it will be very hard for the rest of the world to overcome and defeat the demons that came haunting the world and came out of Europe.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer, Martin. But the thing, what my feeling is that if you look at people from other parts of the world, like let's say to Chinese people, they still feel a very collective have still a very large collective identity. You also have more collective and national identities in the Middle East, for example. So maybe we can look towards those people. I mean, they still have more sense of religion, sense of nationhood in non-Western part. I think maybe the problem is purely Western more than it's a global problem.
I would agree, yes, absolutely, but that's exactly where I say where we have the differentiating factor. So if this is not a natural and logical conclusion of hedonism, liberalism, capitalism, but it's this ideological, the new cultural hegemony, new guiding ideology of Europe, which is anti-European, anti-Christian. This is ideology of self-loathing, because also self-hatred gives you identity. So it's a very strong sense of identity. I don't think it's a conspiracy that was forced upon us. I think it has deep roots in European thought, in Romanticism, Christianity. Obviously, it's kind of an inversion of universalism. And obviously, like the Germans, because they're always the most crazy and radical and everything, are those who are like exaggerating the most. So I would say this is the reason why we have less in-group preference, and we have less just national identity in those groups, that we have this ideology of self-hatred and of making it up for our past guilts and our past crimes.
David, Mr. Engels, do you want to reply to what the things that Martin has stated now?
Perhaps 2 points leading the discussion also further from what we just told. One point, again, a very technical point. I agree with what Martin is already feeling. That is that there is a new young generation that is emerging, and I mean, I've been working for more than a dozen of years in order to show that this classical nationalism has no future in view of the big issues that we are facing now as a European civilization. We need young people to feel probably even first European and then German, for example, because we are all facing these same issues, and mass migration is of course a huge issue. There are many others also, so we need to work together. That is something that is sure, and it is I see with pleasure that there is this movement of slow uniting and overcoming the typical boomer sovereigntism and so on. So that is certainly a good point. But of course, we have also to think about about demography, and if we now look a little bit into the future, then at least in 10-20 years the situation will look much worse for us than it looks now. There will be an even huger disproportion between people of migrant background and people of European or autochthonous, or however you want to call them, background, especially when, of course, the older generation, as is obvious, unfortunately, will slowly start to die out. And so any window of opportunity of somehow dealing with the risk of seeing Europe or the European civilization disappear, so the window of opportunity will slowly close, or rather it could lead to a very conflictual or confrontational model. Because already now, if you look at many countries, not only the UK but also Belgium, I mean, many of the leading politicians are already of migrational background. And I'm saying that even without judging them, just as a matter of fact. So it is not anymore some people from the outside who are living a peripheral world life versus Europeans who are more or less in possession of their institutions. But already now it is slowly reversing. So in 10 years or in 15 years, we can wonder whether it will not be very late for any such a program. I think this is something we need to take into account, because the last thing we would like to do is, out of any form of, let's call it goodwill, hastening even the self-destruction of our civilization. That could be a real risk. The other point I would like to make, and already Martin alluded to that, and I think that was a really, really important point, is that sometimes I'm really wondering, is mass migration one of the, I mean, of course it's one of the biggest points we have to address, but when I see, for example, when I go to a local mosque, which sometimes I like hearing preachings, predications of local sheikhs, just wondering what they are telling and how they see things. And it's really interesting to see that if you hear the predication of a traditional Muslim sheikh or imam, basically 95% of all that is conservative rhetoric. It is something where most conservatives in Europe would say, yeah, you are right. We're talking about hedonism, against materialism, against self-destruction, against self-hate, against the self-destruction of the family. So there's so many points where of course, there are many points of dissension. It's another civilization. So we are in a civilizational clash. But when you hear many traditional or conservative Muslims, you can talk with them because they have a God, they have family, they have a view of history, they have a certain pride in their. So you can disagree with them. Obviously, you want European to stay, or Europe to stay European and not to become Muslim, obviously. But still, you are talking about the same issues. You can understand each other while disagreeing. But there is this new cast of people who are so disconnected with their own identity, their own body, their history, their tradition, their view on transcendence, that sometimes I find it much more difficult to speak with a leftist or woke white European than with a Muslim. Of course, I would disagree with the Muslim also, but at least we have certain points of connection where I feel as being on a totally different planet than many people from the left. And so that is why I always am wondering, well, this fight for migration, I see the risk that it could be also taken over by a certain very liberal, perhaps even left liberal view on European civilization, like we need to protect our hedonism, our materialism, our liberty of self-destruction, our self-hate against this evil Muslim patriarchy. And I see this is something that is already starting with Ceuta, this kind of rhetoric where you see people from the other side suddenly wanting to build a fortress Europe against tradition. And basically the main reasons they would put forth in order to exclude Islam would be basically the same for also excluding Christianity. You would say, yeah, well, they have rather their God than the law. They have this patriarchal family. They love their tradition. They have their strange prayer times. They have their rituals. They believe in eschatology, in the end of times, in the hell. So they are all old-fashioned, archaic death cults. And if I hear that, if I hear many of these anti-Muslim rhetorics, I feel as a Christian as saying, okay, well, I could, from a certain point of view, say, yeah, that's me too. And so I see that also. I mean, I'm just opening the question, but I see that as a risk in the fight against mass migration, that it could, in the end, even strengthen, in a perverse way, a certain tendency towards the self-destruction of what the real Europe should be. And I think this is something that we sometimes tend to paste over because we think, well, yeah, let the liberals and the conservatives work together as long as somehow they manage to push back mass migration. But I think there's a real risk also that in the end it could backfire against precisely what we would like to defend as identity.
Exactly. Okay, Martin. Now I'm going to ask you a really big, difficult.
Could I maybe answer to that, because I think it's a very important question, and I think of a differentiating view. So I agree completely. I think you could maybe all of us here could have a nice conversation with a traditional Sufi sheikh, a way better one than with a liberal Marxist feminist. But I think that obviously does not create any political similarity or interest. I always compare it like when two soccer teams are having a communication after the game. The two goalkeepers, they can way better communicate with each other just like the two strikers and forward center of the game, because they have a similar role in their society. But that doesn't mean that they have the similar goal. On the contrary, they are very opposed. So I think that's just like a very abstract similarity. And I'm not afraid of liberals in Europe because they'll die out. So if you take away migration, great replacement, this whole liberal thing will die out. And the only thing that will survive, look at countries like Israel, look at the Mormons, look at the Amish. The only pro-natalist cells are those who have a big story they want to pass on to their children, which mostly is a religious one. So I don't think the liberal are a big issue. Obviously, yes, they still try to push the ideology on our children. They try to, in a way, persecute, but I would say more repressed traditionalist milieus. But a Muslim takeover would become very brutal and it would become irreversible. A culture decline is something you potentially, maybe, can reverse, but a population replacement and a massive Islamic majority is something that cannot be reversed. And if you want to see what will happen, you just have to look at every country where a Muslim minority became a majority demographically. It always was a very, very bad outcome for the Christians. So I would say, yes, this crazy, decadent, hedonistic liberal might be problematic, but is still part of my people. And just as somebody who's my family, who might be a drug addict, alcoholic, absolute egoistic scam of a human person, he's still part of my family. And that is something where I say blood is thicker than water. And I think that the liberal threat from within, a decadence, is something which is to overcome, while the great replacement and then the colonialism of especially Islam, which is a side effect of the great replacement, this is something which is way more dangerous. But on the same hand, I also reject the rhetoric of like a fight against Islam in itself, a new anti-counter-jihad movement. I don't like it when you are really hurting people's religious feelings and cultures. I think also this is not necessary at all. I completely respect any culture and people, especially in the sphere and nation, but I think we also ought to have our own, we ought to have our place here, which is only for us.
Okay, Mr. Engels, do you agree that with Martin Sellner that without the immigration, let's say remigration start, the movement is starting, that liberalism itself and the self-destruction of Western civilization will stop, or because I think historically it predecesses.
That's not my point. That's not my point. I don't claim that without. Sorry, I just have to stress this, not to be understood the wrong way. I don't think after immigration everything will solve itself. We're gonna be in the situation of South Korea and Japan, which is not a nice situation. They have a lot of societal, family, birth issues. But I say I'm more afraid of a great replacement plus Islamic takeover than of our own liberals.
Okay, so Mr. Engels, you are you also more afraid of the Muslim takeover than with our liberal counterparts, or you disagree on that?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if these are the only two possibilities. So that needs also to be discussed. But obviously, I mean, you see the bust of Oswald Spengler just behind me. There's a certain cultural determinism that I can't leave. So I'm a bit less of a voluntarist when it comes to politics than as a determinist, because the study of these different civilizations suggests, of course, probable outcome, and that outcome might indeed not be so totally different from what we are speaking about. But if we look at these late civilizations at the end of the Roman Republic, or at the end of the Warring States, or in the late classical Muslim history, mass migration is a thing. There is generally indeed a slow ethnic, cultural, economic replacement of the original population, because there has always been the same error of recruiting people from other civilizations into the army, letting them in as cheap labor force, for example, and having on their own side not enough kids. That's something we can already see in ancient Egypt, by the way, with a slow tendency towards a certain civilizational takeover. That is, of course, just stopped for a certain while by this final imperial phase, like the Augustan Empire, like the Han dynasty in China, like the Ramessids in Egypt, like the Gupta in India. That's generally the phase where mass migration is perhaps not necessarily totally stopped, but controlled under the auspices of some form of, let's say, traditional conservative Leitkultur. So indeed, there is a certain way back to tradition. We see that in all late civilizations, which is why I think that we will probably witness the same sooner or later. But, and I think that is important, this generally happens under the auspices of an authoritarian state. Which is why we have Augustus, why we have Han Gaozu, why we have people like Sethos or Ramses II, and so forth, because only a political system that overcomes this, let's say, volatility of democratic or other complex systems of competition, as we had them also in China and in Egypt, by the way, with the temple elites and so on. So only a system that could somehow plan a long time in advance could and can take or grapple and fight this migrational issues, which is why I think that very probably, at least in the US, after the Caesarism, whose first signs we are witnessing for the moment, there might be indeed some form of imperial authoritarian stabilization that might present itself, of course, as some form of restoration of the republic, like Augustus did the same. So must not be an empire with a king or something like that, but the Roman system is precisely a system that shows how you can have a fictitious republican structure with indeed authoritarian structures below. And that is something that very probably will happen also in the Western world. That could, of course, help to impose some form of Leitkultur, but rather, I think, if the long-term prognosis on this from this historical point of view would not be that of a mass remigration, but rather that of a mass integration. That is, that such an authoritarian system would, of course, impose some form of patriotism, of military service, of a much more elitarist, hierarchical social and political system, and could somehow from above impose such a system. And I'm not saying that as a political utopia. I'm just saying that as a comparative historian, because this is what happened in most civilizations. Now, of course, is that something that could work on the long run? That is yet another question. If you look, for example, at ancient Egypt and ancient Sumer, you had the mass migration of Libyans and Asians to Egypt. You had the mass migration of Amorites into Sumer. Every time that these people were mass recruited into the army, every time for a couple of generations, it worked more or less well. And then sooner or later, they took over. Again, much more like the Central Asians did in the Han Empire, or like the Mleccha barbarians did in India. So if we look at that, at least from a comparative point of view, we would see indeed some traces of what we spoke about, but also some probably more dystopian aspects, like that also of a certain loss of political freedom. Now, we can, of course, ask, do we still have political freedom in the present political system? But that's yet another question. But that would accompany that problem. And yeah, the final question, of course, but that becomes then very philosophical, is, well, is this reformed, restored, authoritarian civilizational state really something that is worth living in? Is it not some form of fake tradition? Is it not some form of strange compromise between liberal elites and traditional elites, just under some form of authoritarian leader. I mean, already now, the way that the US is going under Trump is, for many, I would say, true Christian conservatives from a European point of view, not necessarily the example to imitate, even though on the other side you can ask, well, is there any feasible alternative to what is happening over there? So a lot, once again, of open questions. Once again, I don't have any agenda I want to pursue. Just as a historian and as a patriot, a European patriot, these are all the questions I'm trying to grapple in my own mind, and that can animate the debate.
Okay, thank you very much. That brings me with another question I prepared. Martin, Hannah Arendt, she warned that when a state can strip one group of rights, rights are no longer secure for anyone. If the state gains the power to redefine settled minorities as provisional inhabitants, what prevents that same power from later being used against political opponents or members of the majority? And in that case, well, you will probably be one of the first to lose political rights. So when we already see this happening, that the law is really against us. So is that a big risk?
It is, and I completely agree with you. Obviously, if you make it a norm that you can just strip a certain group of people of its citizenship, then you are actually demanding for a revolution and for a dictatorship, because next time the other people are in power, they would do this to you, obviously. And so this demand, a lot of people don't really understand it, but that's a problem, so to say, of isonomia of the modern liberal state, the atheistic state of everybody has the same right. You cannot give this right and take them away again without completely destroying the whole structure, the trust in law, and actually calling for a civil war. So that's the issue. I agree. But on the other hand, the system will also not work anymore. And that I completely agree with Mr. Engels. This chaos will lead to some form of order and restructuring of order. But that would be my question back to him. I don't see any way how this order could work in a bigger state building sense without remigration. I don't see any possibility or any shared identity for this order, like not even the Americana as we have in America, because even like the worst, most radical Islamic guy like Azor Mamdani has to, in a way, adhere to this American patriotism of making America better, has to at least act as if he was assimilated. That's not the case in Europe. And I see a big difference to all of these ancient examples. Today, like, we have a different legitimacy of power. Power doesn't come from above. It's not sacred power. Power comes from below. It's the principle of the majority, of the sovereignty of the people. And this is intrinsically linked to elections and votes. That's a big problem of the left today right now, because they try to create some kind of moral authoritarianism with censorship and with ideology, and they're fighting against populism. They're fighting against democracy, against the will of the people. And the people itself, with the ethnic vote, is already creating ethnic parties. So we're already seeing the process everywhere. And some parties are ethnic parties in disguise, like a lot of socialist parties. And what will happen is a total fragmentation of the parliament, like we already see in Egypt or in Lebanon or like in Syria. But in the end, I don't see any chance for an authoritarian system, except if it was a total brutal dictatorship of a warlord who's just taking power because he wants to stay in power. Before I see a fragmentation of the system, because the power that keeps democracy afloat, Böckenförde famously wrote about it in Germany. He called it eine homogenitätsverbürgende Kraft, a power that is establishing homogeneity. This is gone. And when this is gone, and without remigration it will be gone, there's no chance and no possibility for any rule of law even in this system. So I don't see also an authoritarian system coming up or a traditional system coming up, because which tradition? The Islamic tradition. So I also don't see a communist system coming up. The communists were stupid enough to destroy the basis for class war, which is also a homogeneous society. It will be along ethnic lines, and as soon as the money runs out, we'll have conflicts of distributions, and they will take the form of ethnic conflicts, hopefully not too violent ones. And that's why I see that remigration is the only solution to defuse this ethno-religious ticking time bomb we're sitting on right now. And I understand and I know that more and more people will come to this understanding. And more people also in the elite of the state, in the now liberal elite of the state, in the functioning class of the state will understand there needs to be a rehomogenization, and they will understand that it only can work with a big push for remigration. And that's why I'm still optimistic. I think it will work, and I think with ethnic shocks and formative events, sorry, I'm again preaching my remigration agenda. I think it will work, and I just think there's no other solution, tertium non datur, and that's why people will wake up to this reality.
Okay, thank you very much. I still have some other questions, some other topics concerning migration. You criticize mass migration, but how far are you willing to criticize the economic system that makes mass migration useful? I mean, our capitalistic system is using migration for lowering wages and etc. And it's well, if I can state the a talking point of liberals, of capitalists would say, yeah, you need migration to survive, to economically survive at this point. Over to you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I'm critical of like a complete unhinged capitalism. I think, yes, I'm for a market. Obviously, markets have been part of human society forever, but the market should be in a society, not the society should be inside the market. So that's how I would phrase my criticism. But I still don't think that the economic question is the real cause. Again, we have other countries which are totally capitalistic, hyper-capitalistic, like South Korea, and still they don't opt for mass immigration. And I also think that that at the moment we don't have an alternative to the system. There was a big war between communism and capitalism, and before corporatism as a third option. And at the moment, the brightest minds are thinking about how can we control the reality of the market, of technology plus market. I don't think that solving the issue of the ethnic replacement and remigration can be linked to the issue of solving the crisis of capitalism, just as it cannot be linked and chained to the question of solving nihilism. Because if some people say, we need to solve the problem of hedonism and nihilism and the problem of loss of religion and the capitalism before we can even talk about remigration, I would reject that. We can talk about remigration first. It's one thing everybody can agree on, the libertarian, the atheist, the Christian, the traditionalist, the Evolian, the Nietzschean. We all can agree on that. We need remigration. So it's the most common demeanor. And then, yes, I agree at some point, or like later on, we also need to criticize the root causes. But to conclude, I think, yes, there are economic interests in mass migration, but at the moment, the statists and the political groups who are profiting, the asylum industry, which in itself isn't capitalistic, but very statist, very socialist, they are profiting way more at the moment for mass migration than actual entrepreneurs who are fleeing the country, who are leaving the country in swarms. So everybody who can, in terms of his work, a lot of young people I know who are very gifted, very capitalist, are now fleeing the country because they don't want to pay for this monster, this cold monster of ethnic redistribution, which our system has become.
Mr. Engels, do you have anything to reply to the things that Martin has stated?
Well, the question we can ask if we now speak about the market, the need for consumers, the need for cheap labor force, is to what degree artificial intelligence and robotics that is developing very quickly now, especially in China and in Japan, are not making that argument very quickly, very obsolete in a disruptive way, probably even. And so that perhaps many people who were interested in imposing mass migration may perhaps suddenly lose interest even on that. I mean, you have seen how quickly the climate crisis has got much less support from the moment on many investors realized that they needed to construct huge data centers with a lot of energy stability, and that somehow turning down energy production was perhaps not a good idea for that. So we could perhaps see also a very rapid change from that point of view that could leave the migrants perhaps even more stranded somehow. So I'm not even sure if that would be a good point. I mean, on the one hand, of course, it could once again create also some querfronten from a certain point of view, because if it comes to the fundamental choice, to what degree do we want to live in the transhumanist and post-humanist way? Once again, I think that the Christian and the Muslim and the Jewish and many other point of views would probably be the same, in opposition to an ultra-Promethean libertarian point of view. But the other element would, of course, be that perhaps the migrants are perhaps much less useful to certain form of capitalist system very soon than they are now, which would probably not really create very good stable conditions for our social well-being everywhere. So that could even enhance even more potential conflicts. And I would absolutely agree with Martin. These conflicts will, at least partly, play along certain ethnic lines, as we see that in France nearly every day, that can be a real risk for the future. Perhaps just a footnote to what we heard previously about legitimacy and democracy. I'm much less optimistic when it comes to the foundation of our modern societies. Yes, this has been, of course, democratic for many decades, but I think, and once again, I'm saying that with a certain sadness, but I think the self-destruction and self-delegitimation of democracy, or of our current democracy, is such that I do not think that majorities, the state of law, and so on, are fundamentally important terms for the young generation. I think for the migrant generation, anyway, they are not, because especially the Muslim point of view on politics is very different from the Western point of view. But I think that even so many young people of Western descent are now so disillusioned with what our democracy have become, that I'm not sure that on a long run this system will have to continue to work like that, which is why I used the analogy with Augustus. Augustus too presented himself as being the restoration of the Republic. The Roman system was deeply pluralistic and, well, not democratic, but I mean based not on sacred authority, but on majorities. But it had become so delegitimized that it was quite easy, after decades of civil unrest and so on, to impose a certain compromise that on the one hand could legitimate an authoritarian rule, but giving it a facade that made it more or less acceptable for the people. And I mean, what Welbeck showed in Soumission, that is a president of Muslim background, for example, but with whom everyone could somehow live or work, could be indeed a possibility. It doesn't need necessarily to be someone who preaches for one community. I mean, if you look at most of the dictators in the Near East, like Assad, for example, they rather came from minorities. So people who were from minorities, who wanted to defend their own little minority, and who were acceptable because of precisely that reason by the bigger groups, which is why we often had so many Belgian politicians within the European institutions, by the way, in the good old times. That could be, of course, also a perspective for the future, that this imposed multiculturalism that is there and that will remain there even after remigration can probably only be maintained in a more or less peaceful way by a more imperial system, and probably not a democratic system that would rather indeed lead to a conflict of these different groups. So that is a bit the fear, and at the same time the prognosis I would have. Because once again, I would like to insist on one point. Yes, we can speak a lot about remigration, but the biggest part are people who live already in countries, in traditional old countries like France or the UK, for 3 or 4 generations. They are partly assimilated. I would be the last one to say that they all hate us or so on. So they are indeed partly integrated, but a large part of them does not feel European. They still cling, and I think rightfully so, to their own traditions, to their own religion, to all that. And they, of course, are so integrated that I do not see how in any way remigration could affect them, but they are still demographically so powerful that they will impose upon the future of the Western civilization a presence of Islam we will never again probably get rid of. And I think, from my point of view at least, even with all remigration, this is, from my point of view, the main crux. But that might be also perhaps a different, I see that as a different of the debate between the German sphere and the French-speaking sphere, because once again, as I said, in the German-speaking sphere, yeah, there were the Turkish immigration, but it is not very comparable to the Moroccan and Algerian and so on. And so Germany suddenly realized, oh, there is a thing like mass migration after 2015. And France or Belgium or UK has lived through that much earlier and is a situation where migration for many generations with many intermarriages and so on is so entrenched that it will remain a significant block that we will somehow have to live with. And I don't have really an answer. I don't see how we could do that on the long term with a shrinking economy and all our self-hate and the decline of Europe in a peaceful way without undergoing what happened in Rome.
Martin, we're going back to our start. Even with the remigration, it is a big possibility that minorities will play a role in our demographics, in our politics. How do you see this? I mean, indeed, in Belgium, in UK, and France, there has been migration for many generations. I think 3-4 generations. Even with remigration policies, they are probably not affected and will remain a role.
First of all, I think it's a bit dangerous to call them minorities, because globally, on a global scale, we are the minority. We are the rarest people on earth. If you look at like white women under 40, I think they're just 1.2% on earth. So like we're the rarest minority, and these people will not stay a minority. They will become a dominant force. And I think that there will always be a state in Germany, of course. There will be a state, but it will not be a German state anymore. The state ruled by different ethnic interest groups who are on their hand also controlled by the outside, which is the main problem, obviously, of an ethnic enclave. You have the Sorbs in Germany, for example, but they are an historic ethnic minority integrated in German society. Nobody has an issue with them. There are several ethnic minorities, but for example, the Afghan minority, I'm using the term myself, the Afghan migrant population, or the migrant population from Algeria, they obviously are the fifth column of their own state. So you have power brokers, that the Turkish secret service has completely infiltrated the Turkish community in Germany. They are double voters. They can vote at home and they can vote in Germany, and they're going to be leveraged by Turkey. This is not evil. It's a completely normal thing to happen. In that situation, the Germans will completely disassociate with the state. They will do what's called emergency libertarianism. And the libertarian tradition in America has a big ethnic dimension. There's been a lot of studies. The reason why America never developed a socialism, in part, is due to its multi-ethnic composure from the beginning. Communism always in America would have been an ethnic redistribution from white people to black people. People never named this because it was not nice to talk about it, but this libertarianism in America also has to do with the multi-ethnic dimension of America, not only black and white, but America was a very tribal society, Irish people, Polish people, and so on. And the more tribal societies, the less democracy works. We have Lee Kuan Yew, the benevolent dictator of Singapore. He has written and talked extensively about it. So multi-ethnic society needs to be authoritarian at some point. I think it will happen. But then if remigration doesn't work, our next strategy, I've also written a book about it, it's called the Strategie der Sammlung, the strategy of gathering, would be to completely decouple our ethnocultural continuity, or identity, or education, or security from this state. That would be the logical reaction. It would be something that the Basque people have done for centuries, the Jewish people, German minorities living in the East. So it will be a new phase. And in this phase, obviously the end goal would be like the Kurdish people to at some point have a home and a state again. There would be a lot of German enclaves. The German diaspora would support these little pockets. And then the Germans would flee the fallen West. They would gather in a certain area. And here, I'm more optimistic. Let's go back into history. Let's go to Covadonga. Let's go to the Reconquista. Obviously, I had to bring up this example. You had also a lot of Muslims living there. They've been living there for generations and generations and generations. And everybody would have thought you're crazy to see them leave at some point. Well, it happened. The Reconquista happened. And today, we have a very different world, but different in many good ways. With AI, with the development of automatization, we might not have singularity and post-scarcity, but as Mr. Engels said, every necessity for relocating human people on a large scale on the globe might evaporate in the next years. There might also be the possibility with technological breakthroughs to lift up the home countries of these people to a standard of living which is not as bad anymore. And in that sense, I strongly believe, and that's also my ethno-pluralistic credo, that everybody rather would like to stay at home, that everybody should have a homeland for himself. And I love and respect all people, but I want to have a homeland for my own. I hope this will be all of Europe. I hope we can save all of Europe. But even if we can't save all of Europe, we're going to regather in certain areas. And this also would be a similarity to the end, the fall of Rome. The Benedict option, as some call it, Mr. Engels has also written about it. I hope for remigration. I'm getting more optimistic by day. But in the end, the most important message from my part, because I think we're also closing the end of our conversation, is it will always go on. It will always go on. We'll always find a way. And the European spirit will survive.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sellner. Since we're indeed going to our end, I will state two more questions. You just talked about their home countries, the home countries of the migrant population. I think it does. Well, my question is, if Western foreign policy helps destabilize regions in the Middle East or in Africa, does Europe not bear also any responsibility for the migratory pressure that follows? I mean, we've already talked about the Syrian migrants, but I've been to Syria in 2016. I mean, you had a lot of Western backing for jihadists who eventually took power. But it destroyed the country. I can't really blame Syrian people that they migrated from that situation. I mean, at certain villages, there were, I think, 70 or 75% of the young men already died. A lot of people, millions of people living below poverty lines. And then, yeah, if you hear a politician saying, well, we're schaffen das, yeah, just come along, then I can't really blame the Syrian migrants. But do we have another responsibility to change our policy also towards the Middle East and towards Africa and not blow it up to pieces?
I would strongly disagree with this rhetoric, because I think it feeds a bit into this idea of guilt and this idea that we Europeans are the masters of the universe, which means our doings and our mission are the cause of every harm in the world, and other people don't really have an agency. So if you have a lot of pigment in your skin, then you don't have an agency, because if you're poor, it's our fault because of capitalism. We didn't help you enough and we exported weapons. And if you come to Europe and you're not rich and thriving, it's our fault because we're not giving you enough chances. So it's this strange idea, like I would say it's an heritage of European philosophy, where we are the only subject of the world and everybody else is kind of an object. And when they're not doing well, it's our fault. And if you bring up the Syrian example, very good one. Obviously, I agree, up against interventionist wars. I'm for a multipolar world and we should change this at all. First question is, how sovereign are we in Europe? Is what's happening in Europe right now that, for example, Germany, Ramstein is serving as the base for American operations there, is this really our fault, or is it happening like in the Warsaw Pact? Are we really sovereign? So that's the first question. Is it really us doing this? And the second one is, why isn't Saudi Arabia taking in migrants? Saudi Arabia and other countries played an important incremental role in the destabilization of Syria, because they were paying these groups there, because they also wanted to weaken the axis of resistance in Iran. So even without Europe, there would be a lot of war. Without America, guess what? Iran and Saudi Arabia would be in warfare, and China would intervene. So warfare, unfortunately, is a conditio humana. It will always happen. It also happens when we don't intervene. And if you say warfare or poverty gives people a moral right to come to Europe, I would strongly disagree. Don't claim you're saying this. I say we have no obligation at all to take anyone in, but we have a responsibility to work towards a more peaceful and more multipolar world.
Mr. Engels, we talked about the multipolar world. Do we have, as Europeans, also can we change our policies towards the Middle East, towards Africa, to the European benefits?
Do we have even a policy towards whatever? I mean, in comparison to the big players like China, like the US, like Russia, even starting even comparison with India, the European Union is nowhere. I mean, our nation states are becoming more and more laughing stock of the rest of the world. And the European Union is absolutely without any form of constructive power. So I would say that at least for the most of the current conflicts, probably our own moral responsibility remains rather limited. That was not the case, of course, in the 19th and large parts of the 20th century. But for the moment, we are rather vassals of others and following then really having our own policy. So from that point of view, we should say that the ones who really destabilized the Middle East were, of course, the Americans, not the Europeans. So the migrant currents should rather than cross the Atlantic than go to European Union. But of course, this is quite easy on the other hand, because there is this question of our feeling of responsibility for people who are in need. And I mean, I would identify or consider myself as a Christian. So this is something I feel if I see that people are indeed in need. I think there is something like compassion, like the wish to help. That is a natural feeling. But I would say, against the instrumentalization of Christianity by the left, I would say this has to remain, in principle, a private feeling. So if I feel connected individually, if I feel touched by the misery of someone else, nobody makes it impossible for me to help, to send my money, to say, hey, live with me, go in my home, live in my flat, I will give you money. But it is an individual thing. But trying to recruit the entirety of a state and to create a long-term liability for the future generations, that is, of course, something really, really different. And Christianity teaches, of course, yes, on the one hand, we have always this possibility of the individual, spontaneous compassion and love of our neighbor. But when it comes to the organization of a society, then of course there's also the ideology of the Ordo Caritatis, which means that we are more responsible to our kids, to our friends, to our village, to our nation, whatever, in a concentric way, than to the furthest human being. Now, of course, all that is a huge and very theoretical debate. I would say that the tipping point is achieved not only when a civilization becomes submerged economically, and of course, we are not yet at the point where we would have reached now Nigerian conditions, of course, but also when a civilization starts to disappear. And I would say that this point of seeing the Western or European and Christian civilization in Europe slowly disappearing is in eyesight. And so I think there is indeed a certain right of us, or for us also, to defend our civilizational continuity, which doesn't mean, of course, and I think we should insist on that in rightful cases of specific situations of harms of people who are indeed persecuted, who are not just fleeing economic situations, but who are perhaps also politically persecuted, who can prove that, and so on. Of course, there will always be possibilities also of integrating and of welcoming people. But I think that the limit of where Europe ceases to be Europe and ceases to be a civilization that can even somehow welcome other people is slowly being attained. But another point, perhaps to be added on to all that, is that the huge migration streams we are seeing for the moment are not just due to some forms of political destabilization, but also simply to a certain jump in civilizational benefits. I mean, look, for example, at the huge population explosion in Nigeria. This is, of course, the main reason of mass migration from Nigeria. It's not because we are somehow destabilizing the country, but because this country, through its population explosion, is destabilizing itself and cannot indeed somehow nourish the hundreds of millions of people who are currently living there. But of course, it's not our fault, neither as Europeans nor as Westerners, that suddenly we have such an explosion. From a certain point of view, yes, it's our perverse fault, because we invented large parts of the medicine and the technology that made it possible for many countries to have a population explosion. They cannot really sustain themselves. Of course, not all migration streams are due to that for these points, but I would just want to underline that this responsibility dialogue or discourse we often have is sometimes also due in a perverse and involuntary way to some of the benefits the Western civilization has brought to the rest of the world, and that has suddenly created disbalances and disharmonies that work in a very detrimental way to societies who are not yet accustomed to dealing with these issues, and who somehow need to deal with this population surplus, which is also why I don't believe that many of these countries would want to see so many millions of people back. Probably they are happy to see them gone in order to create their own stability. I mean, another point we just alluded to just at the beginning of our discussion is, of course, the point of sending back people. I mean, it's an obvious knowledge that many of the Moroccan immigrants to France or to Belgium are people the Moroccan authorities were quite happy in seeing leaving the country, because Morocco is a state that tries to create some form of liberal conservative Islam. They do not want fundamentalists in their own country, which is why, strangely or perhaps logically, a significant part of let's say the Moroccan diaspora is much more conservative and fundamentalist as the people living in Morocco itself. But that shows also why probably the king of Morocco will not be extremely happy in suddenly getting 2 or 3 millions of people back who would probably be his political enemy. And so that leads us back again to this question of leverage, and not just of financial leverage, because I mean our limits are our means are not unlimited, but also of very concrete economic and military leverage. And I think, once again, the remigration issue backfires basically, or at least leads over to a lot of other political issues. And I think the European issue and how to construct a European state somehow, or a European Union that would be able to help this is probably a crucial one, because within the current European legislation, I do not see any possibility of using that as a support for any form of migrational policy. So that's why once we we touch the migration issue, this leads to a lot of other issues that are, of course, potentially very divisive, especially for the political right, because there are so many people who rather would want to destroy the European Union instead of realizing that this is probably the most important means of leverage of dealing with migration.
Okay, thank you very much.